So the evidence-based strategy that we are going to be focusing on today is self-monitoring. It will have a specialization on reading. We recognize that self-monitoring, however, is a low-intensity secondary prevention strategy that has been designed to improve student self-management skills in order to support academic skills or behavioral skills or social development. It does involve teaching our students how to independently observe and record whether or not they are engaging in appropriate skills or behaviors at a particular time. So this is a very flexible strategy that can be used to increase occurrence of those desired skills or behaviors that you want to either increase or decrease, right? So when we're looking at self-monitoring as it focuses in on those reading challenges, we are really thinking about how this activates comprehension strategies in our students in order for them to be able to do things like decode and derive meaning from the words that they're reading, from those sentences, from the text that they're reading, and how they can continually self-check and determine if what they are reading is truly making sense to themselves and within that context. And we know that when we implement this type of strategy, it can benefit students from preschool age to high school age students. So this certainly can benefit any of our students, from our preschoolers to our high schoolers that are receiving perhaps special education services, or even those students that may not, that may be demonstrating some risk factors and are struggling. So this is definitely something that you can consider for a large population of students. So we need to ask ourselves when we use this intervention and where, right? So we can certainly use this intervention in a variety of different environments. Self-monitoring is proven to be pretty flexible in that it can be tailored to a lot of our academic needs as well as behavioral or social needs. So again, we can use it in a general education classroom, a special education classroom, or any other environment. It just depends on what is that skill that you are looking for our students to focus on. And in regards to its effectiveness, we know that when it is implemented well, self-monitoring strategies can most definitely positively affect the productivity, the accuracy, and the academic performance of many of our students, especially those students that have a diagnosis of ADD or ADHD, or students with emotional behavioral disorders. So we also recognize that research does support self-monitoring to have that high social validity across those grade levels, and we have seen that many of our learners really do gain a lot of the skills and the confidence in order to navigate their learning in their classrooms more independently, and they're able to transfer responsibility for this learning from their teachers to themselves. So this positively affects that learning for many of our students. We also recognize that a lot of the evidence we have now suggests that these outcomes are certainly being able to be generalized outside of the classroom, and they have been proven to be maintained over time. So how is it that we get started with the self-monitoring intervention? And the first thing that we really do need to consider is encouraging our students to become active self-monitors. And we want to start doing that by asking those questions that really promote that type of self-evaluation in the first place. So we can do that in a variety of different ways by using things like different self-evaluation forms for reading, different types of checklists that we can later kind of go over in our sample slides here. But we want to make sure that we ask those questions like, how is it that how do you feel about your reading, or if they're doing some sort of writing task right after that, what are your current strengths if in reading right now? What do you enjoy the most about reading at this time? We want to get these questions answered so we can have some information from our students. And what is it that you feel you need to improve with your reading? We want to make sure that they know where they're at, they understand where they need to be. So this helps us really get into that that process where we're going to be working together to make up that self-monitoring either checklist or form. So it gives us a starting point to work from with our students. And these are just some of these samples that we can certainly consider in the self-evaluation form. As you can see here, we really want to make sure that we ask the student, how he feels about the current book that he has read. And you can see at the bottom it does ask that question, why I mark this scale as I did, if they're considering having if they've had a rough time reading that book. You want to make sure that you have that self-monitoring checklist, and you want to ask that student, let's think about my reading. Let's think about your reading. Before reading, did I do the following? And during the time that I did read, did I stop and think? Did I, change predictions from what I was reading? These are the things that, that we're going to be looking at, and how we can better incorporate these types of checklists for those students that are having these types of reading challenges. And if you see at that bottom part right there, it still continues to say, to improve my reading, I need to. And again, this really does provide the student with an opportunity to go back and really contemplate and evaluate where they're at. And that's what we're going to be striving to do for our students, to promote that self-monitoring piece. So when we're thinking about, what the research really does tell us, and the effectiveness, of this strategy, we want to remember that it has proven to be highly effective and cost-effective. So we recognize this is a low-cost intervention. This is not something that there isn't necessarily, a fancy reading program that goes along with this, or any kind of other classroom management program. This is something that is individualized, for each of the students or your class. And it can be easily implemented by any educator across instructional tasks. So it is not solely a reading task. You can certainly implement the process for anything from behavior concerns to any kind of other behaviors, like social skill behaviors that you'd want to increase or decrease. It is pretty efficient in its implementation process, and it is considered to be, a lot less intrusive than perhaps, other interventions. It does promote that self-evaluation that in turn is going to make sure that it does increase independence as well as confidence. And we again have seen it to be generalized outside the classroom environment, and it is maintained. We have seen it to be maintained later on. So we know that it contributes to not only those academic gains, but also the acquisition of the self-regulation skills, which is considered to be a crossover skill between academics and behavior. So that is something that it is considered to be, again, we are hitting those executive function skills that we really do want our students to hit. And we're looking at how it may be more effective than teacher-managed strategies for some kiddos. This is something that we also see that many of our early readers can learn a lot of self-correction skills from, but it can also develop, it can also help developing readers to start exhibit a lot of new skills. So we have noted that there is a large amount of success and effectiveness under the self-monitoring evidence-based practice. So now what we're going to be going into is some instructions for implementation, and what are those steps that we really want to follow in order to make sure that we're able to implement a self-monitoring strategy for a student. So we're going to be going over the 7 steps, and our first step is going to be identifying that target behavior. And after that, we do certainly want to define that target behavior or skill. You want to make sure that you do collect some baseline data, that you design those procedures and those materials, you get those materials ready. You want to make sure that you teach the student to self-monitor, that they're able to do that. And after that, you still want to, of course, monitor that progress for the student. And lastly, you're going to want to follow up and fade out that support system for the student. So when we're thinking about implementing self-monitoring, for a class or even for an individual student, you want to make sure that you discuss the goal with the student or the class. Each student may choose their own goal or their skill that they want to improve. You want to make sure that these are written out in positive terms. You want to collect and chart your baseline data, so you want to set those goals. Determine when and where this is going to be monitored, and you want to make sure that you create some chart or some sort of visual reference that the student or the students are going to use. You don't want to forget that we still need to teach our kiddos how to do this, and again, we're going to be following up with our student or our class. So our number 1 step, right, our step number 1 is going to be identifying that target skill. And we always want to remember that whatever we do, we want to state that target skill, that target behavior in positive terms. So what is it that you want the student to do? What is it that we want to increase? You want to consider where and when that behavior occurs, and this is going to assist us in determining the location or the activity that we're going to determine that location or the activity that we're going to be monitoring. So think about where they need to demonstrate that skill, if it is in your classroom, in another teacher's classroom, if that skill needs to be demonstrated and generalized at home or somewhere else, because that is the first step in being able to start that self-monitoring process. So the second step that we're going to be looking at is defining that target behavior. So when we're looking at defining that target behavior, we do want to make sure that it is an observable, measurable skill, that we state it in a positive manner. So you want to speak with your student or your students about this. Have some input from them. Include those necessary steps that are required for this skill. So what are those steps? Are we on the same page? Are we using vocabulary and language that our kiddos are familiar with in order to, for this to be a successful self-monitoring process? Think about everything that needs to be followed in order for that student to demonstrate that skill or that behavior, and make sure that we write it in a way that it is positive, that our students understand, and it will be observable and it will be measurable. It will be something that will be able to be tracked. So these are some examples of those target skills. If something that we're working on is completing the daily reading log, then what does that look like for our student? What are those steps or those skills that they need to do in order to demonstrate that? So completing the daily reading log means that they need to skim the book before they begin to read. They need to read at their pace to understand what they've been reading, and they may need to ask themselves questions. So those are the things that our students will need to make sure that they're doing. Another example is if that target skill or that target behavior is going to be read 5 books a week at the end reading level and answer comprehension questions at 80% or above. So it needs to be that specific. So think about what are those target skills or behaviors, and we need to make sure that those two are observable, measurable, and written in positive terms that our students can understand. Step 3 is collecting baseline data and information. So we need to ask ourselves, how often does this student demonstrate this skill or behavior right now? And in order to do this, we might be able to go back at past benchmarks or any kind of work that perhaps our students have done in the past. So examine those permanent products that demonstrate that skill for that student and record all that information for future analysis of progress. So we have some information on where we started, where we've been, and where we're going to be going, and where we've ended. So when we're moving on to number 4, step 4, we're looking at that design procedure and those materials that we are needing. So determine when the student will perform the self-monitoring in your classroom or in any environment. So think about how will that student be prompted or cued to engage in self-monitoring. So what is that going to look like, for that student? When are they going to know that that's what they're going to be doing? So after we do that, then we're able to begin creating that self-monitoring chart. And we need to be considerate of it being age appropriate, making sure that that target skill does have all the necessary steps that the student needs to follow. And lastly, you want to create an area on that chart that has identified a goal that our student is working towards. So it depends again on what is that focus for your student or your students. These are just some samples of what those may look like for the student. You can have something as easy as stickers that they may just need to put on each of those sections that they've completed, and they write down their goal for that day, if it was meeting all 3 of those, if they've done all of those. So it's going to look, it might look different for each of your students, but again, you want to make sure that there is a goal in mind for them, that they write those down, that they're able to track their progress. Step 5 is teaching the students to self-monitor. So you want to discuss with your individual student also their target skills, or have students even discuss that in pairs if that's something that you'd like to do. Allow them to set their own goals. Give them that opportunity. And again, you want to create a cue or a prompt system if that's necessary for your students, so they can begin to engage in that self-monitoring. You want to also allow some time at the end for completing their chart, their visual, and you additionally want the students to be able to chart their progress or to graph their progress, so they are actually witnessing growth and they're seeing that, and you want to make sure that you give them that opportunity, because that's going to be something that is going to be highly motivating, for them to keep going. So just as it can be difficult for our students to receive prompts or cues to self-monitor, what are those things that you will be using to remind yourself as a teacher to do this with your students? So this is also something that we may want, you may want to think about. Am I going to be using a Post-it note to remind me, to remind my students to self-monitor? Am I going to be having an alarm on my phone? Am I going to be using some sort of timer that is going to help me do this? Because oftentimes the follow-through, that implementation piece, is the hardest, and sometimes we need to do this as well as teachers, to have some sort of system that holds us accountable as well, that will eventually and ultimately really help our students be on track too. Step 6 is monitoring progress, and remember, you want to give students positive feedback for monitoring that skill. That is an essential piece of self-monitoring. You want to also perhaps consider having students check in with their peers to monitor that skill. Have them do that in pairs. You want to make sure that that feedback is faded periodically, but you do not want to provide, you don't want to forget to provide specific feedback, to that student when that target skill or goal is met and or displayed. This is a big deal, so you want to certainly, celebrate that victory and celebrate that big with your student, because it has been a goal that was identified by them, and it should be a really big deal. And the last step here is, of course, step 7, which is the follow-up with our students and fading that out. So you want to make sure that you reteach and you review any skills that may be needed. You want to make sure that you review student progress again, and it's so important for us to celebrate those victories. So really think about how we're going to be celebrating those victories individually with our students, or if you're doing it as a class-wide intervention, how we're going to be celebrating that victory as a class. You want to make sure that when a student demonstrates this skill consistently, they're using this skill consistently and they've reached their goal, then you want to consider reducing the times of week that they're monitoring that too. Because obviously that means that there's progress. And then lastly, you want to make sure that you check in with the student for maintenance of that skill, because we want to make sure that, again, it does stay strong and it is maintained over time. So lastly, we want to always remember that self-monitoring can certainly equip our students to assume that greater responsibility and to become more active participants in their own learning. This evidence-based strategy certainly positively impacts academic performance, but we recognize that it's not the only thing that it impacts. You want to make sure that when we're considering this strategy again, come to a consensus with students on the definition of that behavior, like we've mentioned before. Develop a simple self-monitoring form and set that goal with that student. You want to provide consistent reinforcement, like we've talked about, for meeting the goal or correctly monitoring that skill. And again, celebrate those victories big, because we want to make sure that our students continue to engage in the skill necessary for them to be productive and also navigate their learning environment successfully.